It is my pleasure to introduce the panelists for this session. And I'll ask the panelists to turn their cameras on as I introduce them. I'm not going to, oh, I see some people already. I'm not going to read out everyone's full bio, so I encourage the audience to go to the website, our website, to find out more about each person because we have an extremely impressive lineup today. Starting with Luke Mahoney is the head of technology and innovation for Vale Base Metals. This role includes leading the low carbon agenda for base metals. Emily Thorn Corthay is the founder and CEO of Thorn Associates, a decarbonization and energy management consulting firm specializing in mining and metals. Mark Fellows is a co-founder and director commercial at Skarn Associates, a mineral economics consultancy focused on energy and carbon. Brian Huff is Vice President Technology and Product Line for Sandvik's BHEV business unit. And Maarten van Koppen is VP Product Management with MacLean Engineering. Thank you all for being here today. I think it's going to be a really great discussion, having spoken with you all before last week. As Robert mentioned in his introduction, or as we talked about earlier today, decarbonization has become a priority in the mining sector very, very quickly. All of the major mining companies have committed to net zero scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050. And just last week, we saw the ICMM, International Council on Metals and Mining, release a statement to that effect on behalf of its members. So I want to start by getting a sense from all of you of how realistic that target is of net zero by 2050, and whether companies should actually be aiming higher. Luke, can we start with you since Vale is an ICMM member?
Thanks, Alicia. No, I think this is the question. For me, if you ask, can we achieve the 2050? I think we can, but we don't know how. And I think it's that vulnerability of we don't know how, but we need to work together to try and leverage and collaborate to achieve that. And so naturally what we've done, we've announced the 2050 net zero, but we've also got the interim 2030, let's reduce by 33%, because it's even important for us to check ourselves to how we're tracking against that. It's great to have a 2050, but we won't know until 2045 until how we're going. But I think that 2030 interim is quite a key goal, which a lot of us have made also. And so if I reflect on the 2030, which normally is a 33% reduction of absolute emissions, and what that means is business as usual will more than likely increase as grades go down and new operations go in. And so that 33% becomes a 40 or a 50% when you start to really break it down. And so is it achievable? Yeah, I think half of our initiatives to reach that 2030 goal are NPV positive. They make sense. It's efficiency. It's being more efficient in how you use your electrical equipment. It's being more efficient from a process. And so there's a lot of just do it. Let's get on with it, and it makes sense. Then you probably start to get to a quarter where you need the incentive of a carbon price to really, okay, let's start to kick this off. We're going to need a little bit of help because it's not there yet. And then the further you sort of go on let's call it a marginal abatement curve, this is where, yeah, this is technology that big capital investment, high operating costs, and it really needs a change in technology to really see these accelerate. So the technology is there. I think we've got to focus on reducing our scope 1 and 2, and I know we'll hopefully talk about that later, but it is there, and that's where we need to prioritize. And then naturally, I think the remaining technology to reduce to a net zero will evolve, the carbon capture and other type methods, but we need to accelerate or mature those, but at the same time focus on reducing the scope 1 and 2, especially in the interim, have those interim goals.
If I can just add, Luke, Alicia, to what Luke was saying, great comments, Luke. In terms of targets, if the audience haven't heard of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, I think that's an excellent place to start. They go by SBTI, so again, I'll say the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And they have some great guidance. the ambitions keep getting bolder, though. So you do have to keep track because, you know, initially to be a science-based target aligned, you could be just, you know, 2 degrees Celsius, sort of maximum global warming of 2. Then it was well below 2, which is approximately 1.7 degrees Celsius. And now just this summer in July, they've announced to be SBTI aligned, you now need to get behind a 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is just on the scope 1 and 2 for now. So I think that's a great resource and place to start. And to answer your question, Alicia, about, you know, should companies be more ambitious? I think if they can at least, you know, keep up with the SBTI, which again, very rapidly keeps getting more ambitious, that's already very challenging for mining companies. And if you can do that, I think you're doing really well. And in terms of achievable, I think it's great, Luke, how, as you said, that vulnerability, you know, it is really difficult to predict how to exactly get to 2050. But again, if we go back to the SBTI guidelines, to have an SBTI aligned target, it actually has to be between 5 and 15 years out in the future. So it cannot be 2050 right now to be an SBTI aligned target. So that's why most companies are at 2030 right now. And so getting out to 2030, I think that's generally a 42% or so decrease from your base year to align with the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so to get there, that's generally possible on a corporate level. And I think, again, these targets on a corporate level, so every site does not need to do that. So I think mining companies can really strategically look at all of their assets and choose, you know, which one are easier to decarbonize. And then unfortunately, you know, which ones eventually to potentially divest from, right?
Great point. Any other perspectives on this question about how ambitious these targets are?
I'll add that. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Brian. Go.
I was just going to add that a lot of pressure gets put on the mining companies to do this, but it's really a group effort, right? You know, all of the suppliers and the energy generation companies, everyone's really involved. I mean, Scope 2 is involved with the supply of energy. Where you get that energy is a dramatic impact on the amount of GHG emissions involved in that. You know, there's very few jurisdictions that are really fully renewable, and so there's a lot of work, I think, going there. And you know, we see ourselves as one of these enablers, right? We're enabling you to use these renewable energies as a fuel for the operations that traditionally wouldn't be, and that's kind of what Sandvik's doing to try to make this happen.
Mark, please go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yeah, what I was going to say is I also have a real faith that the industry will achieve the goals, but it's right now it's impossible to say exactly how it's going to be achieved. And the other thing I would point out is there's going to be some huge structural impediments in that there's going to be a logjam on several fronts. And I guess some of my fellow panelists might, you know, I'd be really interested to hear what they have to say, in that it's easy to envisage how the equipment manufacturers' order books are going to get pretty blocked out by the major mining companies as low carbon mobile equipment becomes available. So that it's, you know, obviously there's going to be a hell of a logjam when it comes to sourcing that equipment. And there's also going to be some real issues with the viability of a whole bunch of mining operations that simply don't have the mine life or the reserve quality to justify reinvestment in a decarbonised mining fleet. And there's also loads of implications for mines which are just simply physically not configured well for things like trolley assist. There's going to be huge infrastructure impediments in terms of building out electricity grid capacity to mine sites where they want to take on extra grid supply to pump into that electrified mobile equipment. And I think those things are going to have a massive impact on the strategic position of various players within the industry. And it is going to drive M&A. It's going to drive financing. It's going to drive offtake. It's already doing those things. And this is why our thesis for the last couple of years has been that the whole energy transition is going to be the big strategic driver of the mining sector for the next couple of decades. and we don't know how it's going to pan out, but it's really going to be interesting.
Maarten, do you have anything to add?
Well, I should say something too at this point, right? No, I think it's interesting too to look at it from a different perspective, that some of the maybe more junior companies are already committing to a net carbon product in the pretty near future. And I think the interesting thing is that how that works out on the capital market, where they're all of a sudden able to attract investors that are not typically drawn to mining, which is an opportunity in itself. And the other thing that I was thinking as others were talking is that whether companies commit to be fully carbon neutral by 2030, like some have, or have an interim target that will get them to the path of net neutrality, equipment that you buy today, you get next year, and then sometimes that equipment lasts for 10 years. So it's that decision making, if that's the path towards neutrality, it'd be interesting to see how that's going to infiltrate current day decision making, not just at the top, but in all levels in between the top and the actual machine operator, right? So those are some of the things that that were running through my head as we were kind of discussing these things. And then finally, I think there's some low-hanging fruit. I would say that mobile equipment in underground mining is by and large getting there to be zero emissions, whereas open pit equipment, or for example processes like steel making, that might be a little further out. So I think on how ambitious companies need to be, it really depends on the profile of where their carbon emissions are. Like I said, I would imagine that using carbon for steel making to eliminate that part is definitely very capital intensive and still pretty far out there from what I understand. So.
And then maybe one thing, just on something Mark mentioned, 2050, a lot of the mines that are operating today aren't going to be there. And the ones that are usually the long life, low cost, and they can afford to decarbonize one way, where it's about the project managers and the innovative thinking on how do we design the mine of the future. And normally project managers are relatively risk adverse in terms of how they go through their process, and it's how you really enable the thinking and look at the upside potential and really put that in the project framing as you start to mature these projects. Because as I said, 2050, it's going to be a whole different portfolio of mines than what we have today.
So we've established, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, one more thing to add in discussing projects. It's really important from a strategic perspective when you're setting your targets to have a climate lens on any investments in terms of acquisitions or organic growth expansions that you have, because we won't go into it in detail in this panel because it's too technical, but there is a very different treatment in the targets, again, if you're going to be SBT aligned, of a acquisition of a mine versus an expansion of an existing mine. And they're treated completely different, and it dramatically affects your targets and how you can achieve them. So if you're not aware of that, again, that's a really, really important point when you're developing these carbon roadmaps, and strategically when you're looking to the future to 2050 as to which, your growth. So.
Great, thank you. Let's talk about the how. We've established that mining is on the road to net zero, but what does a typical roadmap to net zero look like? Where are miners starting their efforts, and what are going to be the most difficult places to cut emissions? Emily, can we start with you here?
Sure, yes. I caught the tail end of Tony from Kirkland Lake Gold's speech, and he did a good job as a CEO of talking about sort of roadmaps. And actually, it reminds me of, we went to the Energy and Mines conference like years and years ago, and they had 5-minute TED Talks from CEOs. And at that point, no one had a clue, like none of the CEOs knew really much about decarbonization. So it's really heartening these days to see the CEOs and chair of the board really get involved in this. So in terms of a roadmap for decarbonization, again, Tony is right. You need to understand basically where you are today. So your carbon footprint, or in a GHG accounting speak, that would be called your greenhouse gas inventory. And you have to have it right, by the way, because most mining companies who have not had a third-party independent verification have some pretty significant, I guess, aspects that need to be corrected. So I would highly encourage you, if you haven't had that sort of independently verified, there's some big things that can be, make some big changes. The second step after you've verified your greenhouse gas inventory would be to do a business as usual projection. And that might sound simple, but there's quite a few nuances with respect to, again, your growth strategy, and that when you're trying to go out to 2050 or even 2030, many of your mines, or some of them, you know, their life of mine might end before 2030. So how do you account for that? And then, of course, the target setting. And then in terms of specific technologies for your roadmap, usually you go on a site-by-site basis to look at the greenhouse gas abatement technologies. So starting with renewable electricity is really the enabler, right? So the number one enabler is somehow getting renewable electricity. And if that's not possible, that's going to make it a lot more challenging. So maybe, again, because your targets are corporate, try and start with the sites that have a easy and not too costly ability to go 100% or close to that renewable. Second, after the renewable electricity, would be to electrify transportation. So, of course, battery electric has already been talked about. We have like 2 BEV manufacturers on the panel, and fully agree that's a really important part. But another part that's simpler, that's maybe not talked about, is conveyors. Simple conveyors, cheap conveyors. They have very proven technology. When you can replace trucks with conveyors, that's a really cost-effective option that's available now today. So don't forget that as well. There's also more sophisticated conveyor technologies like RopeCon and Railveyor and that kind of thing. And then, you know, if those are not available, biodiesel, usually there's a maximum of 20%, but that could be a transition, or renewable diesel, you can get to 100%, but availability is usually an issue. And then in cold climates, like most of Canada, you know, you need to ensure you have no carbon heating of underground ventilation and camps. So looking at, you know, at least heat recovery as a start, or those are, and some, I guess, to answer your last question about what's the most difficult, haven't seen really too many great ready-to-use solutions without explosives. So explosives right now are a small portion of emissions. They don't get talked about, but as we decarbonize the rest, eventually those will be probably some of the last, maybe mechanical cutting will be there by then, but that's something that's not being talked about right now.
Luke, can you tell us a little bit about Vale's roadmap to net zero?
Yeah. From the work that we did, where we probably spent the last 18 months to really understand where the emissions come from, and we came up with about 500 initiatives, and we've consolidated that down to about 200 to consolidate down to 100, etc. And so if you start to have a look at that, the common themes, there's 4 themes. I think one is the energy efficiency, fuel switching, and process optimization. There's a lot of opportunities, and I think from a Vale point of view, we do the mining, but we do a lot of the processing also, and so a lot of our emissions are from the processing side. And so be more efficient in what you do, and you'll see that. The next one is the low carbon power, where you don't have a clean grid, look to implement, and obviously these are much more longer term investments and decisions, but really target that low carbon power. Second, and then the next for us is heat recovery. I think to the point, we currently use a lot of fossil fuels to generate heat as part of the process, but then we lose a lot of that heat through slag and through other methodology. And so how do we start to capture that heat and reuse that heat, which then minimizes the use of introducing more fossil fuels or other fuels? And then probably the hardest is back to the fuel switching. I think there are some quick opportunities there, but then that's when you start to get on the right-hand side of the abatement curve, where the technology is not there. I think for large trucks, electrification and other electrification of furnaces, it's very expensive from a technology. It's not as efficient compared to I suppose the current fossil fuels. And so how do you find a transition? Maybe natural gas is a transition, biomass or a biocarbon, but then you've got the supply issues. That is a good way before electrification. And so the 4 things for us is efficiency, low carbon power, heat recovery, and fuel switching.
Maybe if I can add sort of my perspective from before when I joined MacLean, when I was working for Newmont and Goldcorp, is that aside from the technology roadmap, just getting a general awareness of carbon emissions and understanding where your current emissions are and how to forecast that forward, making sure that that starts to make its way into the business planning process as you're working out different scenarios, that you're not just looking at the ounces of gold or the pounds of nickel or whatever you're producing, but that you have carbon emissions as one of the outputs that you can then evaluate against other scenarios. And that sounds very simple, but it does require that you know where your carbon emissions come from and how you can, to some degree, forecast them. So that goes back to some of the baseline work that Emily mentioned before. But I think just that awareness and getting that on the radar is equally important.
Can I ask Brian, we heard from Sandvik earlier today, we heard a presentation about electric equipment, and it sounded like a real no-brainer in terms of efficiency, productivity, and so many other metrics. Can you tell us, shed some light on how quickly companies are looking to replace their diesel fleets and why they may not be going any faster than they are?
I think, as was mentioned earlier, supply is a challenge. This is still new, and there's a lot of interest. But there's definitely a really significant commitment from multiple, and as was mentioned earlier too, it's the big mining houses that are really pushing this at the leading edge of adopting the technology. And I think to what Emily and Luke both said, that is, I think, the right step in the roadmap. I might say that you actually might want to put things in a different order. Go electrification first, and then work on where the source is, because you can make some dramatic gains just from the electrification aspect itself. One thing that kind of putting all this together, right? That as Luke mentioned, and Emily, in cold climates, you have to heat the air going into your mine. If you can get rid of your large number of diesel particulates underground, you can decrease your ventilation flow, right? Less ventilation flow requires less heating. So it's a compounding benefit on the electrical energy usage. We've had customers that actually reduced their electricity consumption by converting to electric drive trucks because of that heating cost itself. So it's kind of a little bit counterintuitive that you're now powering your fleet by electric power, but consuming less net electricity for your mine site overall. And it's kind of like I say, it doesn't seem obvious, but it's true, especially for cold climate mines. And so that step can be taken even before you start looking at renewables. And then there's another potential value in battery electric technology, and especially with swapping technology. And there's a few OEMs doing it that way. That battery can have some secondary uses. You can use it for buffering renewables. You can use it for frequency regulation or peak shaving, to really create mine electric infrastructure that's better capable of adopting renewables and getting toward that full net zero.
Great, thank you.
I might add, we had a little bit of data that we analyzed from one of our customers, and that was in a jurisdiction with clean energy. But if you were to do the thought exercise of working out what it would be if they grab the energy from dirty diesel generation and compare that to the amount of diesel that they would have burnt on a truck had it been a normal diesel operating, it would still 3 times cleaner to get the power for the BHEV truck from a diesel generator rather than running the diesel engine. And part of that is regeneration. It's just inherent efficiencies within the system. So even if your power is super dirty and you don't have any ventilation savings, you can still cut back on your emissions significantly. So
I'll add one more number to that is just in like the US average is not very clean, to be honest. But we see just a diesel to battery electric truck conversion is going to save about 40% in GHG. In Canada, it's more like 88%, and in Quebec, it's 99.9%. And that's just from the diesel fleet. And for like most average mines, your fuel is roughly 50% of your greenhouse gas emissions just for your trucks and loaders. So just taking that first step actually will get you to your 2030 goals.
And if you don't mind me chipping in on this,
Yeah.
this is one of the interesting differentiators we see in our work when we aggregate our asset level GHG numbers across the industry by country. When we add those numbers up, look at the country totals, the countries with coal-fired power really stick out, and it then becomes really difficult to see how places like, say, South Africa or Mongolia or Kazakhstan are really gonna make an impact on their emissions until they address that. Particularly when you, in, say, South Africa, you have a whole load of really deep underground mines with very high ventilation and cooling requirements, already using an awful lot of electricity. So that, coming back to the previous question, although reduction in scope 2 is an obvious easy win in some cases, I think in other parts of the world it's going to be a lot more difficult. And then obviously when you get beyond that, you're getting into all the more, even more difficult scope 1 stuff that we've just been discussing.
I think we're going to stay with you for the next question, Mark. I wanted to talk a little bit about reporting and measuring of emissions. How close are we to standardization of measuring and reporting on scope 1 and 2? And also, if you can talk a little bit about what's involved with measuring scope 3 emissions.
So I thought Emily's point earlier about when you dig into companies' reported emissions, you find many irregularities. Exactly tallies with our experience. And we have many conversations with mining companies as potential clients when we initiate the conversation by querying numbers and say, where did you get that particular emission number from? And did you realize there's actually a more useful, say, grid emission factor for that locality? Or, you know, what emission assumption per litre of diesel are you actually using here? Or did you accidentally add an additional 0 to something? And it's really quite common. And I think it's quite indicative of the fact that everybody's on a very steep learning curve with regard to emissions numbers. From our point of view, we have our own methodology, which is entirely based really on the greenhouse gas protocol, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. But what we found really useful is to impose a system boundary on those that reflects the mining industry or a typical mining process stream. So when we think about scope 1 or 2, it's pretty easy. Obviously, you're looking at whatever's burnt or consumed at the mine site. But the scope 3 stuff that we think is most important or most useful in the current instance is to make sure that you're quantifying the emissions between the mine and the downstream processing in terms of the freight. So we look at the concentrate freight for the base metal mines from the mine gate to the smelter refinery, and we also quantify smelting and refining emissions. So we go through the smelting, the smelters and refineries, and quantify what their emissions are. And so our real focus goes up to the refinery gate, which to us and many of our clients seems to make a lot of sense, because we all tend to think in terms of the minor scope of influence, if you like, being from rock in the ground through to refined metal. We don't go beyond that currently, but we do encourage our clients to look at our methodology, and generally the feedback we get on it is very good. It seems to be that we're covering most of the stuff they're interested in. Where it gets way more difficult, obviously, is when you get into particularly steel and coal, where you've got all of that scope 3 further down the steel chain, which we don't currently cover, although we've got a plan in place to start covering it. And this is where a lot of the mining companies themselves, I think, are, and Luke, I'd be interested to hear your input on this as an iron ore producer. You know, the mining companies themselves are being held to account by investors for their scope 3 emissions down into the steel making chain. And there's a lot of quite complicated stuff going on there in terms of, is the right iron ore product or met coal product going into the most appropriate steelmaking process, and to what extent is the miner responsible for that? So there's a whole bunch of stuff there that I've just unpacked a little bit, but I'll throw it open to the rest of the panel to correct me or elaborate on stuff.
Yeah, Luke, maybe you can start off.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so I think we've been tracking Scope 1 and Scope 2 for some time. Like, and you start to have a look. And when we went on this journey, yeah, we've got the numbers, but it was from the lens of an accounting. We have it, okay. But what decisions can you make from that information? Okay, natural gas comes to the mine, but does it go to the plant or does it go to the mine? We don't know. Or okay, how are we validating some of this work for decision-making process? So we spent the last 18 months really reviewing the entire process, redoing the mass balance, the product balance, so we could know where the material was or the emissions were going to enable decisions to be made. And so we needed to change that. And so I think Scope 1 and 2, what was mentioned with the principles on the GHG protocols, and you got to remember, it's not a checklist of, hey, you must do that, because we don't want a checklist yet. We're not ready for a checklist. But the principles of transparency, materiality, consistency, it so holds true. And if the intention is to really move forward in that way, which Emily mentioned, the science-based targets really pushes, well, it mandates that that's what needs to be done. For me, I think that's where we need to really evolve, I think, from a Scope 1 and 2. And I think we are getting there. We are understanding, but we don't want to keep changing also, because we want to know, have we made a change because of what we've physically done to reduce emissions, not because of the factor that we've done, and say, hey, we're good. And so this is where you start hearing the terms greenwashing in some respect. But then you get to the Scope 3, and I think that's an interesting one, where much more immature. I think if you think upstream, which are the suppliers, you can have a lot more influence, I think, from that point of view. But at the same thing, the suppliers, like Brian and Maarten, what is the footprint of that machine that comes to site? The steel and everything, when it comes, what is that? Well, one, is it material, and how are we calculating that? And so we went through a whole exercise to understand the Scope 3. And what we did, we included a pre-assurance process by one of the big 4 accounting firms to say, hey, if we were to do that, can you have a look based on those fundamentals? Does that make sense? And where do we need to go? Because it's not going to be perfect, but it's how do we really move there? And so I think upstream is one thing, which I think the mining companies can really influence and demand. Just like downstream, if you think of the customers, especially for a nickel and copper producer, a lot of it is for the EV market, and a lot of questions are being asked of us weekly. What is your footprint, both Scope 3 upstream and Scope 1 and 2? And so for us, we've now got that visibility. We've now got the processes. We're now talking about carbon, just like we are in terms of costs and safety and production. And for me, it's that maturity and that evolution on, we will get better, but at the same time, we don't sort of want to create something that's precise but not accurate. And I think that's just something we've got to be careful of as an industry.
Well,
Go
can I
ahead.
make one comment on materiality on this Scope 3 side? Just to give you a ballpark, right? The greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of one of our batteries, for example, is completely offset by 1 month of operating on electric versus diesel. So you pay for it in the first month from a GHG standpoint.
So just to build on mainly what Luke and Mark were saying, in terms of measuring and reporting emissions, one thing that has not yet been mentioned is there is actually an ISO standard. So there is the ISO 14064-3, which is the greenhouse gas verification and validation standard. So there are companies who are certified to be able to, verify to that standard. You can also do a soft verification as well. And so that, trying to either align with that standard without necessarily getting, certified is possible as well. So that's one thing. And I think Mark's comments about boundaries is excellent, right? And it may seem obvious if you have not gone through this exercise before, but once you get into the details, the boundaries are extremely difficult, and there's different ways you can do it on an equity share basis, on a financial control, operational control. But sometimes, like, we have one client, they're 50% equity and sort of operational and financial, they're together on the same management board. Anyways, it's not actually clear then what should be in and out, what's material, what's not. So the boundaries to start really upfront with that is really critical. And also, again, wanted to give a bit more color, I guess, to why this measuring and reporting and verifying is so important, and sort of some specific kind of issues we've encountered. We've encountered places where they've gone to the effort of getting a 100% renewable power purchase agreement, but their scope 2 emissions, they're still using the dirtier grid factor and not actually taking credit for the work and what they've paid for the power purchase agreement, or looking at a strategic level with mining company who was looking at carbon offsets and saying, hey, we could maybe just entirely offset our emissions for this amount of money, and they were actually using $170 for like Canadian, $170 per ton going out to 2030. But of course, carbon offset, the market is much cheaper. They're more in like the $5 to $10 per ton CO2e. That's a huge difference. So as going back to Mark, like there's a really steep learning curve, right? Companies that are, I think switching category, the sites are switching categories. So they may have different categories between, like stationary power generation, maybe they have vehicles, mobile equipment, and then different years, especially if you have different personnel doing the reporting, are switching, and suddenly your emissions are like dramatically, I'm seeing a lot of head nodding, right? This is right. This is happening. So if that's happening at your site, first of all, don't worry right now. But the other thing is, we've had discussions that involve finance, et cetera, and like, oh, is this for public companies? Is this going to be a big issue? And luckily, I guess for now, okay, well, no, it's mainly on the ESG side. It's not, shareholders, financial, all that reporting. However, I would predict that will be there one day. We don't know yet, right? There is not the same financial rigor and penalties that you would have if you misreported your earnings statement, but you can bet on it at one day that financial rigor will come to the GHG accounting. So might as well kind of get our, as correct as possible now. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. And Maarten, I just wanted to get you in here and ask you about how, as an OEM, you're working with your customers on the Scope 3 question.
To be completely honest, we haven't gotten it very often. We do take our own measures to try and reduce. There's only so much that we can really do with our plants, but for example, we source recycled steel, so that already has a lower footprint. It's actually funny, today I saw an article that Volvo construction equipment announced that they're selling some equipment with zero carbon steel, which is an interesting development, and it's something that we've internally been talking about. I'm not sure how many manufacturers of zero carbon steel there actually are. So I suspect that's coming out of Sweden. It's still pretty early for us. I'm not going to lie. We're a smaller manufacturer. We haven't thinking about it on first of all summarizing what our emissions are that goes into each piece of equipment, and then what we can do to reduce that. But we're still pretty early in on that process, and like I said, to be honest, we haven't been approached with that question yet. But now that you planted the seed, that might be a follow-up email from Luke after this meeting, I suppose.
Maarten, just a quick comment. Yeah, to our knowledge, the Sweden pilot plant of the two that are there are the only fully zero, but sort of shout out to our Canadian steel colleagues. We are among the very cleanest in the world generally. So if Canadian mining companies purchase, Canadian steel, I can guarantee there's a report out in the US, how clean is US steel, and it ranks Canada among the very top. And there's a Canadian report that's coming out shortly for Canadian steel producers, and it'll say the same thing. So highly recommend procuring Canadian steel.
I think we've just got time for one more question here. I'm going to ask from the audience. Do you believe current ESG frameworks like GRI, SASB, TCFD, and SBTI, I think you've probably know what those stand for, are sufficient to help us reach the 2050 target. So do miners have enough guidance?
I would say too much guidance, but that's a controversial opinion, and I'll keep quiet for the minute while more level heads are allowed to speak. But I have this idea of, I call ESG spaghetti, which is a big part of the problem, where you have so many reporting standards, initiatives, conflicting bodies, and so on. I know it's all moving in the right direction in terms of rationalisation, but I'll say no more than that until somebody more sensible has spoken.
Not that it's more sensible, but I'll speak next. I think the framework, it's a framework, and I think they're dynamic enough, and I think the principles of who's involved in developing the frameworks and how they evolve over time, I think that they are in the right way. You can't get hung up to say that that's the only way I'm going to achieve it. I think it provides a good mechanism to provide consistency and enable society, or as an industry, to really tackle this problem that we don't know how we're going to achieve the 2050. And so I think as long as the frameworks aren't as rigid but still evolve and to help, it's one part of it, but it's the company policies, the company drive, it's industry support, it's collaboration, it's suppliers. I think it's the whole ecosystem that needs to work together, and I think frameworks is just one part of that.
Maybe I'll be equally controversial in this discussion. I think that the engineering side of me wants to say that the overemphasis on how to measure things exactly to the nth degree with all the different frameworks, it creates so much work that it kind of distracts sometimes from actually making a difference. And it's interesting sometimes to see companies who are really precise at reporting how much carbon they have get rewarded in those type of indexes more than companies who focus that effort into making a difference. And so maybe I'll just drop that mic right there. And
well, don't get me started on the ratings agencies. I really I'm going to have to go on mute for that one, I'm afraid, because I find the black box approach to producing ESG ratings quite, provoking, shall we say.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I wish we had a little bit more time to keep this going. But I thank you all so much for joining us today. And Robert is back to take it back. Take back control, Robert.
Thank you very much. Thank you all the panelists. That was actually a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure this is going to be one of the highlights of the day. And thank you, Alicia, for moderating that so well.